I'd like to talk a little bit about casting slip formulation, and just different temperatures of casting slip. So, this um, lecture will cover some items that are already covered or have been covered in previous talks in the classroom, but also are covered in far more depth in your reading assignment, which is part of this module. So, first of all, I would just want to review casting slip and what a deflocculant is and remind you of those kind of details. So, we have here just kind of a quick sketch of what clay molecules look like. They are flat platelets. And when you have a throwing clay and you throw it on the wheel, the act of centering it and pulling up the walls lines these all up, and so that they become sort of in one direction. And that was one thing that makes thrown pieces so incredibly strong. In casting slip, we actually add the same amount of water or close to the same amount of water as we would add to a throwing clay. But these molecules have a charge, so one side's positive, the other side's negative, and that means that the molecules are very attracted to each other, and that's why the clay, when you throw it on the wheel, is malleable but generally solid. So in casting slip, we add another ingredient, and that's called deflocculant. And deflocculant changes the chemical charge of the clay molecules, and so instead of the individual particles being attracted to each other, they are suddenly don't want to be together. And something that would have, without the deflocculant, would have been a solid suddenly becomes a liquid. So what makes casting slip so great and so possible to cast and plaster is that it has essentially the same amount of water as a throwing clay, and but it's liquid. So that's some information that we went over before in class. Just want to remind you of that detail, and of course your readings will go over that in far more detail. Generally, we tend to use a porcelain casting slip. The recipe that we use here at Metro is called Lauren's casting slip. It is used because it is both composed of white clays that, as you will discover in your reading, are deflocculate best, and it is also using ingredients that are generally not too expensive. So it's affordable, and it deflocculates and casts very well. We do have two other clays in the studio. Oh, also, keep in mind, this one goes from cone 6 to cone 10. And someone always asks, can I fire it to a low fire temperature? And the answer is yes, but it's incredibly fragile. It really needs to go to its normal mature temperature in order to have the strength to last over time. So the other two slips we have, I don't have a physical something I can hold, but I put a drip of them on this piece of paper. So we have a low fire white and a low fire red, or a red earthenware. Now, when they're in the wet stage, they all look very different. The Lauren's casting slip is sort of a yellowish tint, but pretty much just a variation on white. And then the low fire white actually looks very, very gray due to all the talc in it. And then the red earthenware is deeply rust red. It's a really beautiful color and texture, and that is red when you cast with it, and it's red after it comes out of the kiln. Now, all of these clays get bisqued the first firing to the same temperature. One thing that you need to be very careful about is that these two clays, the low fire white, which is called White Star. Sorry. And the Lawrence casting slip, after they're bisque fired, they look exactly the same. So it's very important, if you're using the low fire white, that you mark your pieces when you cast them, like with a L on the bottom or something, so that you know that's low fire clay. Because if you accidentally fire this gray clay here to a high temperature, it will turn to soup, it will damage the kiln, and of course your piece will be no longer. And it likely will damage some of your fellow classmates' work as well. So please be very, very careful that if you use the low fire white, called White Star, comes in a 5-gallon bucket with a commercial label, you need to mark your pieces. And then when you go to glaze your work, you need to talk to me and figure out and discover what your glazing options are, which are great. There's a lot of options, but they're different than what you would be using for the Lawrence casting slip. So you need to be looking in a new place in the studio. All right, so that's that. And that's about it for this lecture. I just want you guys to remember deflocculant and to remember the different kinds of slip and some of the cautions and possibilities of the different slips. The Lawrence, I would say, is a more traditional casting slip. It gets a little bit harder than the low fire clays casting slips, but that one advantage of the low fire clays and casting slips is they don't shrink as much. And so if you're frustrated by the shrinkage and warping of Lawrence casting slip, then the low fire White Star and the red earthenware are both great options to help solve shrinkage and warping problems if those are issues for you. All right, thank you.